the shadow of God is interesting. So let's start there. Where does that come from, and what do you mean by the shadow of God?
Well, again, it's Nietzsche, and he's got this vivid image where he describes how the Buddha was meditating in a cave, and after he had finished meditating, he left the cave, but his shadow remained. And says Nietzsche, that's the situation we are. God is dead, but his shadow remains, and we have to vanquish the shadow, which is, I think, as I say in the book, an extremely puzzling thing to say.
Yes.
First of all, it's puzzling because for Nietzsche, God was always a kind of shadow. Right. So, it's not as though there really was a God. It was always a false belief in Nietzsche's view. So what's the difference between a false belief in God and the shadow of God? So that's the first thing.
Mm-hmm.
And the second is, why should we have to vanquish the shadow? I mean, in what way are we better off by vanquishing a shadow?
Mm-hmm.
And those two things, I think, are deep questions. Nietzsche kind of took it for granted that we should vanquish the shadow. But if it's the case that there isn't some absolute, clear, proper way for human beings to live in the world, if there isn't some moral, theological, metaphysical, scientific reality which is a bedrock, which we can, once we've cleared out the nonsense and the myth, we'll be left with something which we can all find, we can all agree on, we can all live with. There'll be no more moral disagreement. There'll be a kind of, as my friend Jerry Cohen once put it, the withering away of social science. There'll be no, the state will wither away, but so will the need for any kind of misunderstanding between people. And if that happens,
mm-hmm.
then of course you'd say, well, let's vanquish the shadow. But I don't think Nietzsche believed in that, and I certainly don't. So there's an open question where, you can point out, and this would be an example that's very close to my heart. There's absolutely no doubt for anyone, and particularly not if you happen to read my book, that very fundamental ideas about human agency, rights, and dignity
mm-hmm.
have their roots in religious ways of seeing human beings, seeing them as in the image of their creator, seeing them as having dignity. And you can trace this out to the point where it came to be seen as being independent of that. But if that's the case, and it lacks those foundations it once had,
mm-hmm.
does that mean that we should get rid of this? Is this something that we should throw out along with the religious theory of their origins? And that seems to me utterly an open question,
mm-hmm.
Whether we should do that. And personally, I'm not going to appeal to a religious foundation for dignity, but I would be appalled personally if people, and Nietzsche certainly did take that step. He said,
yes.
Dignity is just a shibboleth, and it's just a ruse played by the weak against the strong, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that, but I do think he's right to say that it's not something where you can simply appeal to some religious doctrine to give it a firm foundation. So that's an explanation, at least in part, of this. Why I find this picture so intriguing, but also somewhat puzzling.
Yeah, and in a sense, like I'm summarizing something that's incredibly complicated and erudite, as I said. But I think what you contend is essentially that German idealism. And by the way, let me just commend you for writing clearly about one of the most abstruse philosophical movements in history. Because I've always thought the German idealists were profound, but it is unpleasant to read their writings. But your contention, I think, is from Kant through the German idealist. In some sense, a lot of these things that used to be theological were transmogrified into a kind of, so like, just to take one example, immortality in some sense becomes transmogrified from personal immortality in an afterworld to historical immortality.
Absolutely, yes.
Yes, which is a more kind of, for lack of a better word, maybe a more rational kind of immortality, but it's still a kind of immortality, which is maybe the shadow of God. Now, let me ask you this before getting to that, because it occurred to me when you were saying this. Do you think in Nietzsche's famous uh, parable of the death of God, the thing that he was saying there that was important was not that God was dead, because he thought, whatever, like, people don't really believe in God, but rather that people weren't taking his death seriously enough. And that what you were saying about the human rights being a shibboleth and all of these other things, what he was saying there is, if you take this seriously, you're actually undermining all of these metaphysics that we take for granted. Is that a fair reading of that?
Yeah, I think that's certainly the way that Nietzsche thought of a lot of these things. But he also thought he thought in a couple of ways. But